Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Take 5 for Florida history. Today we're hopping in the Wayback Machine to head 2¼ centuries into the past to explore the very origins of tourism in Florida. The tourism industry, in great part, defines the Sunshine State and how it's viewed the world over. If people have heard about Florida, they've heard about its beaches, the Everglades, the nightlife in Miami, its fascinating wildlife, and of course the #1 tourist destination in the world, Orlando's theme parks. I hope it's not a surprising comment that the modern concept of tourism hasn't existed for very long. Of course, people have traveled to new lands for thousands of years, but you can't really call them vacationers, seeing as how they traveled for trade, more plentiful food, war, governmental work, etc. Perhaps the reason that would be the closest to that of modern tourism would be the religious pilgrimage. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is about such a journey, but there is still an earnest goal in pilgrimages. For example, the Hajj, the ritual pilgrimage to Mecca, is a duty required of all capable Muslims. No one would seriously refer to it as simply a vacation. Like so much of modern life, the concept of a vacation or holiday trip developed with the rise of the middle class during the Industrial Revolution. There's no need to go into its development, just suffice it to say that people began to travel simply to explore different places and see the sights. A related aspect would be health tourism. Of course, this would have a serious component, but the majority of people traveling for their health would be going to spas for health-giving waters or to a specific climate that people thought would be beneficial. This new popularity of tourism was facilitated by the invention of steam engines, which would power both boats and trains. The first successful steamboat, built by Robert Fulton, arrived in 1807, and the first steam-powered railroad in the U.S. was built in 1829. Coincidentally, at this time, Spanish Florida would change hands, becoming a U.S. territory in 1821, which opened the largely undeveloped land to exploration and exploitation by Americans. Florida was considered an exotic land and was described in popular writings by early travelers such as William Bartram and Jonathan Dickinson, so it's not surprising that it would become a popular tourist destination. At the time that Florida became a U.S. territory, only the Spanish towns of St. Augustine and Pensacola were established. Fernandina on Amelia Island, which had been created by the Spanish just 10 years earlier, was only a tiny settlement. Jacksonville wouldn't be created until 1832. This means that Florida was very much a frontier area. There were thousands of Seminoles in the interior, most of which had already been harassed by the U.S. Army when the territory was still in Spanish possession. Still, Pensacola and St. Augustine weren't all that difficult to reach, especially with steamboats that would begin to travel from New Orleans or Savannah. Because of its location on the Atlantic coast, St. Augustine would experience travelers early on, and this would be the beginning of Florida's tourism history. Built at the end of the 18th century, the Ximenez-Fatio House is an attractive and sizable, yet unassuming building that dates from 1798. Located in St. Augustine, the nation's oldest city, it's on Aviles Street, just 2 blocks south of the main plaza. I want to mention that we're lucky to have a highly detailed plan of the structure dating from 1936. Created by the Works Progress Administration and the Department of the Interior, they provide a look at one of the city's most significant early buildings. The drawings are available from the Library of Congress. I'll be using them briefly in the video, and I'll make a short companion video that shows them in detail, along with photos for illustration. I don't know if anyone will be interested in them, but I'll make the video anyway. A 1797 Spanish census recorded 1,007 white residents, 483 enslaved individuals, and 102 free black residents in the small colonial city. The British had returned Florida to Spanish rule in 1784, and St. Augustine's white residents were a mixture of the remaining British, returned Spanish, and refugees from Dr. Andrew Turnbull's troubled colony in New Smyrna. who were originally from Italy, Corsica, and the Greek islands. Among the residents were Andres Ximenez and his wife, Juana Pellicer Ximenez. Juana was among the community that had escaped Dr. Turnbull's failed plantation. The Ximenez family were successful merchants, and their new building was a combination home, grocery store, tavern, and billiard hall. The L-shaped structure's front facade is on what is today Avilés Street, although on early maps you can see that the lane, which runs for only 3 blocks, was called Hospital Street. By the way, on each of the maps I'm showing, the house is highlighted in blue. This is the front facade here, and you can see that it's 3 stories tall, with the 3rd story essentially attic space with 7 dormers, 3 on the front, 2 on the back, and 1 on each side. Like most buildings in St. Augustine, it was placed directly on the street, including its southern facade on Cadiz Street. This allowed for an inner courtyard. The dimensions of the building are as such. You'll see that the kitchen building in the back is a separate structure and is slightly misaligned with the main structure, though it's the same age as the house. When built, the ground floor along Avilés Street was designed to house the grocery store, tavern, and billiard hall, the 2nd floor the home, and the 3rd floor to be quarters for slaves and/or servants. Along Cadiz Street, there was a series of rooms that were used for storage for stock and equipment. This wing of the building was originally only 1 story, the 2nd floor being a later addition. There was also the detached kitchen, as well as another small structure for doing the wash. The house and kitchen building were both constructed of coquina, a locally available limestone that's comprised nearly entirely of fragments of seashells. Coquina was mined in quarries on nearby Anastasia Island, which would give its name to the Anastasia Formation, the coastal formation of coquina stone which runs along Florida's Atlantic shore from just north of St. Augustine south to Palm Beach County. You can still visit one of the quarries. It's in Anastasia State Park, only 2 miles from the house. The important St. Augustine historian, Albert Monsey, in his 1962 book, The Houses of St. Augustine, points out 2 of the noteworthy elements of the house. The first, that of its doors and frames, which are British in design, though they were installed after the British period. Unlike earlier Spanish doors, they are lighter in weight and have 6 recessed panels, typical for the style. Then there's the gallery stairway. Interestingly, the main stairway connecting 3 floors, as well as the secondary stairway at the rear of the house, are both located on the broad porch which overlooks the courtyard. There isn't a staircase inside the large structure. This might come as a surprise to us today, but outdoor stairways weren't unusual in St. Augustine. Monsey describes the gallery stairway as, quote, a fine example. The risers are comfortable and there is a landing between floors. The balusters are turned spindles, graceful and well proportioned. As you can see, the WPA plans provide an excellent look at the stairway. The 20-foot or 6-meter long balcony on the front is yet another pleasing feature of the house. While the balcony is narrow, at under 4.5 feet or 1.4 meters wide, considering that the street below is only about 10 feet or 3 meters wide, it appears larger than it is. As far as we know, the family's businesses were successful, but they didn't operate them for long. Juana died in 1802 and Andres in 1806. They were 26 and 53, respectively. Their family continued to own the property until the mid-1820s. As I mentioned in the introduction, this was a turbulent time in St. Augustine, as this was when the United States would take possession of the territory from Spain. While the change of hands was through treaty and not war, it meant that multiple families in the small city would leave, mostly heading to Spanish Cuba, and they would be replaced by U.S. citizens. Free black people who were in fear of being enslaved would also leave, and obviously the Spanish military would be swapped for the U.S. Army and newly formed Florida militia. It was in this atmosphere that a Margaret Cook and her husband chose to buy the property. first purchasing a one-third share in 1825 and finally owning it outright in 1830. Margaret's husband would die before then, which left her as the sole owner. While she kept the grocery business, she converted the rest of the first floor into a boarding house. She also converted the south-facing storerooms into guest rooms. Additionally, on the west side of the property sits the original kitchen. Kitchens were placed in separate buildings due to the risk of fire. In an accident, better to only destroy a small building than an entire home. A side benefit in Florida is that it also kept the heat from the large cooking fires affecting the living quarters. Notably, this is the only original freestanding kitchen in St. Augustine, dating from the end of the 18th century. Not surprisingly, it's quite a large kitchen with a separate bake oven, one of only 2 or 3 original ovens in St. Augustine, and a large fireplace that would allow for high-capacity cooking. While the kitchen wasn't originally built for a boarding house, it must have functioned well to provide for the family, guests, and servants. We also know that at times the public was welcomed in to eat alongside the guests. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of a boarding house, think of it as roughly similar to a modern-day bed and breakfast. Margaret Cook would provide bedrooms for people visiting St. Augustine, as well as hot meals and simple recreation, games, magazines to read, and even music. While St. Augustine would continue to be a frontier town for many years, in many ways it was more welcoming to visitors than places in what we call the Wild West. St. Augustine had a cultural heritage that was as old as any towns in New England, and yet it was situated in an exotic land, significantly different than any other in the U.S. Visually, at least, it looked Spanish, and there were still Spanish families, as well as those who came to be known as Menorcans, the Italian, Corsican, and Greek families, of which Juana Ximenez had been a part. At first, visitors to St. Augustine were often people who would be exploring business possibilities, but soon the intrepid traveler would learn about the charms of the newest American territory. In the 1820s, the only dependable way to reach St. Augustine was by boat. Sailboats at first, but later the aforementioned steamboats. Now one might imagine that they would sail down the Atlantic coast from Savannah and points north, but that was only rarely the case. Instead, passenger and cargo boats would turn into the mouth of the St. Johns River and run south along the slow-moving river to a small settlement. Known as Piccolata, it was little more than a way station that represented the point where travelers would disembark boats and take a mule cart 16 miles or 26 kilometers overland to reach their destination. That trip would follow the old Camino Real, the Spanish Royal Road, which would allow adventurous people to travel to Pensacola. Steamboat to Piccolata was still the primary route people would use to get to St. Augustine through much of the 19th century. In fact, people would have to wait until 1888 before Henry Flagler built a bridge over the St. Johns and finally connected the city to the rest of the U.S. by rail. Margaret Cook would operate the boarding house and grocery until 1838, when she sold it to Sarah Petty Anderson, another single woman. Sarah Anderson would operate the property, hiring a Ximenez-Fatio to be manager of the boarding house in 1852. 3 years later, Louisa would buy the property herself, becoming the third single woman to own and operate the popular boarding house. The 1850s was a busy time. Florida had just become the 27th state in 1845, and its northernmost parts were developing into copies of the slavery-based plantation system so successful in Georgia. While St. Augustine itself wouldn't grow in population, in the surrounding country people would use the 1841 Preemption Act to purchase 160 acres or 65 hectares of federal land on which to live and farm. There were regularly scheduled steamboats traveling to St. John's from Jacksonville, some heading as far south as Lake Monroe and Mellonville. St. Augustine and its sites were beginning to become popular with visitors. With the Castillo de San Marcos, city walls, narrow streets, Spanish architecture, and semi-tropical climate, the oldest city would become the first tourist destination in Florida. The Fatio House, along with a handful of others, would cater to many guests, both individuals and entire families. Naturally, some would travel with servants or slaves, which would also require boarding. Typically, the third floor of the house would have had many pallets, makeshift beds for servants and lower-class guests. House guests included military officers, naturalists who could be studying wildlife, invalids, people stricken with consumption, today what we call tuberculosis, or other ailments, business people, and of course those we'd simply call tourists. The house was a fairly upscale type of boarding house, as can be seen today in its restored state. Indeed, the house resembles the boarding house setup of the mid-1800s. There have been few structural changes, so walking through the 20-room house provides an accurate look at how it was operated by its female owners. Ximenez-Fatio operated the establishment through the antebellum era, Civil War, and Reconstruction. Not surprisingly, the war ended any form of tourism. Florida chose to support the Confederate cause, and initially St. Augustine would be under Confederate control. That lasted only 14 months when Union forces regained control and kept it throughout the rest of the war. While many residents fled, this ended the Union blockade, and food could be brought in for both the garrison and the residents. Still, like the rest of the city, Fatio House would merely hold on until the war ended. Once the Confederacy surrendered, the local economy was slowly restored. It had, at least, been spared any battles or bombardments. Ximenez-Fatio would die in 1875, and her heirs would continue to operate at least parts of the business. The grocery, for example, while other parts of it would become an artist's retreat. Eventually, the property would be purchased from the family by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in 1939. They would restore it and operate it as a museum. Founded in 1891, the Society describes itself as an organization composed of women who are descended from an ancestor who came to reside in an American colony before 1776 and whose services were rendered during the colonial period. The organization has over 15,000 members. They promote appreciation for the people, places, and events that led to the formation and development of the U.S. They own and maintain about 80 historic buildings throughout the country. While few of the current furnishings in the house are original to the house, they all represent the types and styles of items that would have been available in St. Augustine in the mid to late 1800s. Over the 83 years the colonial dames have owned the house, there have been extensive archaeological work on the site as well as ongoing research on the house's records. For visitors, there is both a self-guided tour and a guided tour. They do a much better job at describing the house's contents and how they fit within the context of a 19th century boarding house than I ever could. Besides, my goal is to put the house itself in the context of the history of St. Augustine and Florida tourism. One thing I will point out is that several of the guest rooms are decorated with items that represent the types of people who would have resided at the house. Many of them have their own interesting and surprising stories. As knowledgeable as I am about that time period, I learned some intriguing facts. While I had long known of the Ximenez-Fatio House Museum, it took a serendipitous visit to two of St. Augustine's early cemeteries a few months ago to jog my memory. The history of those cemeteries are covered in this video. While I was at the Tolomato Cemetery, a group of people in 19th century clothing arrived to memorialize some of the individuals interred at both cemeteries, notably both enslaved and free black residents of the city. In the cemetery video, I show some of their memorials. It turns out the group was from the Ximenez-Fatio House and was reenactors connected directly with a program that the museum was offering at the time. Titled, "I Live Here as Well, A Woman's Story," the presentation brought to life the often forgotten lives of women who lived and worked in the house. It was the second chapter in the museum's project to honor the lives of people connected with the house. As the museum states, the Ximenez-Fatio House served not only as a temporary living place for its boarders, but as a permanent living space for many enslaved people and servants who worked within it. Since these peoples were not given a voice in their time, their stories have faded into the background of history. It is our goal to try and bring them into the forefront. I Lived Here as Well is a story as told by people who may have spent their entire lives in this house, yet never used the front door. It was inevitable that Florida would become a major tourist destination. And looking back, the genesis of the industry in St. Augustine was also a foregone conclusion. Everyone who visits the historic city appreciates its charm. We have the writings of its visitors that date back 250 years, which describe the city in glowing terms. Even today, when so many of the shops sell arguably useless kitsch, the sheer amount of real tourist spots throughout the city means that visitors could stay occupied for weeks. Once the U.S. gained possession of the Spanish territory, Florida was on a path to becoming one of the world's most celebrated travel destinations. Businesses such as the Ximenez-Fatio House, which catered to professionals and tourists, including families, would redefine the nature of the boarding house, turning them into proto-hotels. Indeed, while Louisa Fatio died in 1875, it would be only 7 years before Henry Flagler would first winter in St. Augustine, and 13 years before he'd open the Ponce de Leon Hotel. The luxury 540-room resort was located only 4 blocks from the house. That was the point when tourism in St. Augustine shifted into overdrive. Ironically, the house would transition from a place for tourists to stay while on vacation to a destination for tourists in the nation's oldest city. Then again, Flagler's Ponce de Leon would be converted into Flagler College in 1968 and also become a tourist attraction. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you liked it. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.